Hey guys, how are you? Hope you're having a good day. So today our lecture is about pancreatic secretion. Inshallah, it's gonna be an easy lecture. We're not gonna take much time. So let's get started with the lecture. If you have any questions, let me know throughout. And if I was going a little too fast, also let me know. I'll try to go slow. If you don't understand anything, let me know at the end of each slide so that we can explain it before going to the next point. Okay, so let's start. Now, before we start, I'm going to give you guys a general overview of so basically, in order to understand the GI and enjoy, you want to try to understand what's happening rather than just memorizing it. So the first point to understand when you're talking about the pancreas is that what are the goals of the pancreatic secretions? The pancreas is secreting two main substances, the sodium bicarbonate, which is a base that is responsible for removing the acidity after the food just arrived from the stomach. So after the food has been in the stomach is secreting this hydrochloric acid to break down the food, and then it's pushing it over to the duodenum, to the small intestine. It's full of acid and it's gonna hurt the intestines. That's why we're gonna need a base in order to neutralize the acid. So that's the first function of the pancreas. And then the next function would be secreting these enzymes that will help break down the food particles. Now keep this in mind, and all what we'll try to do today in the lecture is go into details and regarding to these points. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Let's start first of all with the structure of the pancreas. Now, as you can see right here, one second. Okay, so on the right side is a picture about a pancreatic exocrine duct. It's made of two parts, an acinus and the terminal duct. You must understand the function of the acinus and the terminal duct to help you keep going with the lecture. Now, let's start with the acinus. What the acinus is doing, it's secreting the enzymes which are responsible for the digestions, and it's also secreting fluids that are composed of sodium and chloride ions. And now the sodium ion is important. Why is the sodium ion important? Because sodium ion is basically going to be controlling the isotonicity. Like when we're saying a fluid is hypertonic compared to the plasma, means it has a higher osmolarity compared to the plasma, or a hypotonic or an isotonic, we're mostly referring to the sodium ions. Now what happens is the acinus is going to secrete the pancreatic secretions that will include the enzymes and the fluid, which is going to be made a little bit of water, and mostly sodium and chloride. So the acinus secretion is determining the isotonicity or the tonicity of the pancreatic secretions. And if we go over the next part, which is the terminal ducts or the ducts of the pancreas, what they will do is that they will take this fluid that has been released by the acinus and start modifying it. The main modification is that they're going to secrete bicarbonate, which is the base that we discussed earlier. So the duct cells are releasing the bicarbonate, which is responsible for neutralizing the acid. At the same time, they are going to add some water, and they are basically going to make it more fluid of secretion. And as you can see right here, after it goes through the pancreatic duct, this is just some anatomy. As it goes to the pancreatic duct, it empties over here into the sphincter of Oddi at the ampulla of Vater. All right? So just keep in mind, the acinus is responsible for secreting the enzymes, and the duct is responsible for secreting the bicarbonate. Okay, let's start with the duct cells. Duct cells are responsible for the bicarbonate and modifying the fluid. Okay, now, why do we need this bicarbonate? As we mentioned, or as you can see right here, the stomach is basically breaking down food using an acid, which is the hydrochloric acid. Now, after this food has been mixed with an acid, of course, its pH is going to decrease. Now, it's fine to be an acidic food in the stomach because the stomach is used to an acidic environment because it's always releasing its HCl. However, this acid, when it goes over to the duodenum or the small intestine, it's going to cause harm. And in order to avoid that, we need to get rid of this acid. So what this pancreas is going to do, because as you can see, it's the first part right here. After the food comes over from the stomach to the intestines, the first thing it meets is the pancreas. So the pancreas must be the first organ to react in order to save the intestines. So what's it going to do? It's going to release something that's going to get rid of this acid. And this will be the bicarbonate or sodium bicarbonate. And its function is to neutralize the gastric acid. If that didn't happen, and if we didn't neutralize the gastric acid, then the small intestines, which is not used to this acidic environment, it's going to get destroyed by this acid, and we're going to get something known as a peptic ulcer. Now, the next function of this this bicarbonate is going to be activating the pancreatic enzymes. What I mean by that is basically as the pancreas is going to release enzymes, these enzymes in the intestine or the small intestine, they need a specific pH because as you remember in molecular biology, like enzymes work at specific pH values. For the stomach enzymes, is going to need an acidic environment. However, for the pancreatic enzymes, they need a basic environment. And if we don't get rid of the acid, we're not going to be able to raise the pH, and we're not going to have the pancreas enzymes functioning. So the main two functions will be neutralizing the acid in order to save the intestines from any damage, and activating the enzymes by giving it the suitable pH. Now, this is a small picture. Those of you who don't really know what an ulcer is, basically an ulcer is a separation in the epithelium, right? So this is a part of the epithelium. It should be continuous right here. However, an ulcer, because an acid, you know, acids, you would know, like acids, basically they dissolve stuff and they're breaking through stuff. So an acid, like just imagine an acid came here and broke down through this, and that's why we get an ulcer. Like now, for those of you that don't really know what an ulcer is, this would help you like remember it in the future. Okay. Now, the next thing you need to know is what is the stimulus for the bicarbonate secretion? The main stimulus is going to be acids, right? Because it's released in order to neutralize the acids. So whenever we have the acids that are going to be found in the duodenum or the small intestines, this is going to stimulate S cells found in the duodenum in order to release secretin, which is a hormone that's going to act on the duct cells. Because what cells we said were responsible for releasing the bicarbonate? We said the ducts are responsible for releasing and modifying the fluid. So the secretin is going to act on the duct cells in order to stimulate them to release bicarbonate. How does it do that? We're going to discuss it in a second, but just know, it does it by opening a CFTR. What's a CFTR? It's a channel that's responsible for basically transporting ions or chloride mainly. Now, the signaling mechanism for secretin, basically what signaling means is as the secretin binds on its receptor that's found on the cell, it used to activate secondary signaling pathways inside the cell in order to carry out the function. And this would be done by cyclic AMP. Okay, is this clear? Let's go over to the next part, which is how this is going to occur. Now, as we said, we need to release the bicarbonate, right? And so the cells must have bicarbonate. Where do the cells get the bicarbonate from? Three main sources, or like two main sources. The first source will be inside the cell, the water and the carbon dioxide that's released after they basically metabolize stuff. So the water and the carbon dioxide, they will mix together by a reaction referred to as carbonic anhydrase. It's a very important reaction. You should like remember its name. It's very important. You should memorize it. Carbonic anhydrase. What it does, it takes water and carbon dioxide, combines them together to give you an acid, which is the H+, and the base, which is the bicarbonate. One second, let me just. Okay, so you get the carbonic anhydrase, which is going to give you an acid and the base. Now, what should we do with the acid and the base? Do we need to release more acid into the already acidic intestines? No, we need to release the base. So for the acid, we're going to get rid of it and exchange it with sodium. That's how you get rid of the acid. And for the base, you're going to release it through an anion exchanger port or channel. The anion exchanger, now, a way to remember it is basically the bicarbonate is negatively charged and the chloride is also negatively charged. And since we want to maintain like the balance of the ions, we don't want to have two negatives on one side and then no negatives on this side. So if we remove a negative on this side, then we get the negative to the other side. And the same goes for positive ions. If you remove a positive ion, then you get a negative ion on the other side. And also, if you look here at the sodium bicarbonate transporter, as you're adding a negative charge, instead of releasing a negative charge, instead you're adding also another positive charge instead to balance the ions. And this is the second source of bicarbonate. So the first source was the carbonic anhydrase, and the second source is a sodium bicarbonate channel. Now, I know these channels are going to be overwhelming, but like when you study everything and as you're revising, have an extra sheet of paper and try to like link the receptors with the functions, because the sodium bicarbonate transporter here is responsible for taking the bicarbonate from the interstitium, which is basically like the fats or like the matrix that's around the cells, into the cell before it can go to the lumen, right? So the sodium bicarbonate is also found in the saliva, if you remember. The saliva is going to be responsible for having the sodium bicarbonate transporter to get the bicarbonate from the interstitium to the cell itself. So like these receptors are repeated over time. And this would help you, like, rather than just memorizing for every single organ independently, you can memorize instead that sodium from interstitium is taken to the cell with bicarbonate. Okay, and then the last thing that you need to know is basically the mechanism. Wait 1 second. I'm sorry about this picture here. Okay, so the last thing you need to know is the secretin mechanism of action. Secretin, what it does, it binds on its receptor, and then it's going to activate the cyclic AMP adenyl cyclase pathway. 1 second, let me just describe for you what this means. Okay, so what this is basically as secretin binds on its receptor, it's going to activate a G stimulatory pathway or a G stimulatory receptor that's going to activate an enzyme known as adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase enzyme is responsible for converting ATP into cyclic AMP. And then cyclic AMP is converted to protein kinase A. And then protein kinase A is going to phosphorylate the receptor because it's a kinase. Any kinase is phosphorylating. It's going to phosphorylate the CFTR channel. CFTR channel, in return, is going to get rid of the chloride ions, which are used by the anion exchanger in order to get rid of the bicarbonate and to get the chloride in. Okay? Now, the most important thing that you need to focus on from this slide is basically this concept about anion exchanger, which is going to basically take a chloride from the lumen into the cell and then release a bicarbonate instead. And this anion channel is fueled by a CFTR receptor that's responsible for pumping the chloride outside. And lastly is the sources of the bicarbonate, which are the carbonic anhydrase and the sodium bicarbonate channels. Also, you should know that secretin is activating the cyclic AMP pathway. That's all for this slide. Let me get back to the normal pointer. All right. Before we get to this, so this is clear so far. After CFTR gets phosphorylated. Okay, so the CFTR is going to be phosphorylated by protein kinase A. Now, like these steps, is not that I don't want to tell you that you don't need to memorize it, but like it's better if you learn it now because it never changes. Whenever you have a G stimulatory receptor, it's going to activate adenyl cyclase that's going to convert ATP to cyclic AMP to protein kinase A. Like this process never changes. So just learn it from now and keep it in mind. Now, protein kinase A is a kinase. So what a kinase does is phosphorylate. So it's going to phosphorylate a receptor called CFTR receptor. Once the CFTR receptor is phosphorylated, it's going to open up and become active. What it does, it's basically an anion channel. It's responsible for kicking the anions out. In the case that we didn't have chloride inside the cell, then the bicarbonate would be the one to be kicked out of the CFTR channel. But in normal situations, the CFTR is going to be kicking out the chloride outside the cell. Now, this chloride is very important because, as we said, to get bicarbonate from the cell to the outside, we need to exchange a negative ion with a negative ion. And this negative ion that's going to be released is the bicarbonate, and the negative ion taken back into the cell is the chloride. So let's imagine we didn't have the chloride here at all. If this wasn't there, then the bicarbonate can't leave because it will create a negative charge around here, but there will be no negative charge to balance it here. And that's why we need the Cl- receptor to allow for this exchange to occur. And again, the sources for the bicarbonate are the carbonic anhydrase and the sodium bicarbonate channel. Is it clear? I'm glad. Okay, so the next part, the effect of the rate. Now, it might seem a little confusing, but instead of just trying to memorize it, let's first of all understand what's the concept of it. Now, if you read this sentence, the higher the rate of secretion, what does that mean? It means that the pancreas itself is being stimulated more, right? And when would the pancreas be stimulated to release bicarbonate? If there is too much acid, okay? So just imagine if there's too much acid in the duodenum or in the intestines, and we need to get rid of this acid fast. So we're going to stimulate the pancreas more and more and more, and we're stimulating it stronger. And what we're trying to do, we're stimulating it because we have the acid. So we're basically asking the pancreas to give us more bicarbonate. So the more we're stimulating it, the higher the rate will be, and then this will lead to an increased bicarbonate levels. And how did we say the bicarbonate is going to be released outside? Bicarbonate is released by the anion exchanger, which basically takes the chloride from the lumen into the cell and the bicarbonate into the outside. And so if we stimulate it more, and the stimulus is done by secretin due to increased acid, means we're basically asking it to give us more bicarbonate, more base to neutralize the acid. Therefore, we're going to have an increased bicarbonate levels and a decreased chloride level secretion. And now if you just want to get the part that you want to memorize, is basically this point. A low flow rate means there's going to be more chloride, and a high flow rate means there's going to be more bicarbonate. Now this picture right here, I got it from external resource, Boards and Beyond. Now I just put it to understand the concept, like ignore the receptors, ignore everything. Whenever it comes to memorizing, like just memorize the stuff here. Now use this to understand what happened. Basically in the ducts, there's a small channel or like a small tubes, and then the larger tubes. The small tubes are responsible for releasing the bicarbonate. And this comes first. So first of all, we release the bicarbonate into the lumen. Now the bicarbonate is moving around here. If it was a slow rate, if it was moving at a slow rate, it's going to come over to this receptor and it's just moving slowly. You know, it stays around the receptor for too long, and then we're going to get rid of all the bicarbonate back to the cell and exchange it with chloride. And hence, a low flow rate will get more chloride ions. However, if it was moving too quick, see, there's no time for it to pass on the receptor. That's why we're going to have a high flow rate. Okay? So just memorize this part, and this is how you're going to understand it if you forgot it. Now the last part for it comes to like the acidic or like the secretions of the ducts is basically understanding the isotonicity and the pH of the fluid that's secreted by the pancreas. Now, if you remember, we said the sodium and the potassium in the first slide, these two are going to be released by which cells? The acinous cells, okay? And the acinous cells, or like, okay, so they are released by the acinous cells. And this fluid, after the acinous, it will go to the ducts. All the duct is doing, there is no sodium potassium transporter on the ducts. There is only a CFTR transporter and a chloride bicarbonate transporter. So the ducts cannot change the sodium or potassium. They can only change the levels of the chloride and the levels of the bicarbonate. Okay, so sodium levels are staying the same, potassium levels are staying the same. This is the first thing you need to know. The next thing is basically isotonicity. What was isotonicity, or like what is it based on? The sodium levels. And since they are staying the same, there is going to be isotonic. Why is it isotonic with the plasma? Let me just put that point straight out here. Now, at this point, at point 0, when there is nothing, all the pancreas secretions will be based on the plasma. So the potassium levels right here are the same as the plasma. The bicarbonate levels are the same as the plasma. The chloride levels at this point are the same as the plasma, and the sodium levels at this point are the same as the plasma. So when it first starts, it's isotonic. And since we didn't change the sodium, the entire pathway is going to remain isotonic. Okay? And what happens to the pH, as we are giving out more base, which is the bicarbonate, is going to become more alkaline, and we're going to have an increase in the pH. Is that clear? When it comes to this part, we didn't explain the SNR part cells. We didn't explain the SNR cells part yet. So don't really focus on it now. Just remember this part right, that we said right here, right? So the ductal cells are releasing an isotonic secretion that's mainly sodium. Ignore the bicarbonate. It's basically mainly sodium that's going to have a high flow because of secretin. Wait, oh, never mind. I mean, don't ignore the bicarbonate. I was thinking this is the SNR. Okay, so the ductal cells are releasing an isotonic, and that's going to have sodium and bicarbonate as the main two. Bicarbonate because it's releasing the bicarbonate. And that's why it's going to have the basic pH. And how is it going to do that? By the bicarbonate. And for the SNR cells, which is the first secretion, is going to be similar to the plasma, and hence is going to be isotonic with mainly sodium and chloride secretions. All clear? Before we go to the next part, which is the SNR cells and the enzymes. Okay, let's go to the next one, which is the SNR cells. Now, the next thing we said is the acinus, which is basically a functional unit of the pancreas. It's responsible for releasing the enzymes. These enzymes, what they do is basically break down the food in the intestines. Now, pancreatic enzymes, there are a few points that you need to understand or like keep in mind. The first thing is that pancreatic enzymes are able to destroy proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. The three major sources of energy or food are going to be destroyed by the pancreatic enzymes. For the carbohydrates, we use an alpha amylase. For the fats, we use a lipase. a cholesterol esterase, and a phospholipase A2. And for the proteins, we're going to use the trypsins, the chymotrypsins, and the elastase, and the carboxypeptidase. What is an endopeptidase and what is an exopeptidase? It's basically an endopeptidase from inside the peptide. So it's breaking the bonds that's found inside the peptide, between the peptides. Exopeptidase, it's basically for exo, so for the outer part. So it breaks basically the terminal peptides that once you break them down, you're basically releasing an amino acid outside. So it's basically releasing a peptide. That's why it's called an exopeptidase. It's getting rid of a peptide. Now, the next thing that you need to notice around here is that the word pro or the word ogen. What does that mean? It means that this enzyme is not active. And this is very important and high yield to keep in mind. The pancreatic enzymes, as they are secreted by the acinar cells, they would be released as inactive precursors to these enzymes. This is important because if these enzymes were active inside the pancreas, what they are doing is that they're destroying the proteins, the fats, and the sugars inside the pancreas, and therefore they will basically destroy the pancreas itself, which leads to something known as pancreatitis or inflammation of the pancreas. And instead, we only want them to be activated in the intestines. That's why when we release them, they are going to be released as the pro or the zymogens or the ogen parts, a prophospholipase or an ogen, which basically means that they're not active and they only get activated inside the lumen. And now we're going to discuss how they're going to be activated. Now, when it comes to the activation, enteropeptidase is basically an enzyme that's going to be found on the epithelium or the brush border of the cells. Now, as you can see right here on this brush border of the cell, there's this enzyme known as enteropeptidase. What this enteropeptidase does is that it breaks down an enzyme, or like it breaks down the enzyme trypsinogen, and it breaks it to trypsin. Once we get trypsin, trypsin is basically like the key enzyme in activating every other pancreatic enzyme. Trypsin is going to activate all the peptide responsible enzymes. It's going to activate chymotrypsin. It's going to activate even more trypsin. It's going to activate the elastases. It's going to activate the carboxypeptidase, elastases, chymotrypsins, and basically every pancreatic enzyme is going to be activated by trypsin. Okay, keep this in mind because it's very important. Trypsin is going to be activated by enteropeptidase on the brush border. This is basically inside the lumen of the intestines after it's released. And then once the trypsin is activated, it's going to activate everything else, even more trypsin. And how do we keep that, or how do we prevent the pancreas from activating this trypsin inside the pancreas itself in order to not activate all these enzymes? There is basically something known as a trypsin inhibitor. If we inhibited this big boy, then we're not going to have any of these. We don't have to worry about any of these. Therefore, we mainly need to focus on a trypsin inhibitor. And if we inhibit the trypsin, then we're good. And then one last concept before we get to that is that basically what happens between the meals and after the meals, or like when does your body know that, oh, now I need to release more of these enzymes, or now I don't need to release these enzymes? It's basically going to be regulated by a hormone referred to as CCK, a cholecystokinin hormone. The CCK hormone is the main hormone that's responsible for driving the enzyme secretions, and we'll describe the mechanism of that in a second. Okay, so this, if you remember, we said for the bicarbonate, it was regulated by the secretin hormone that's going to be made in the S cells of the intestines in order to, or like in response to acid, to increase the bicarbonate secretions. For the enzymes, since now we need to basically break down these foods, they're going to be released by a different hormone that is going to be called CCK, that I'm going to describe in a second. Just keep that in mind, CCK, and this is responsible for driving the enzyme secretions. Now, usually when you're not eating, we don't want to release enzymes. So what happens is that the pancreas is releasing a small amount of trypsin, and this trypsin goes, basically it's known as the basal secretion of trypsin. Basal is basically like the lower limit or the lower level without any stimulus, a basal secretion. It's on a normal rate. So a basal secretion of trypsin to the intestine, what this trypsin does is that it binds on this CCK, or the cholecystokinin reactive protein, or responsible that's going to act a protein that's going to be activating the cholecystokinin. If we don't have this protein that's activating the cholecystokinin, then we're not going to have any cholecystokinin to be released. And if we're not going to have any cholecystokinin, we're not going to have any enzymes. And this is exactly what we want. We don't need these enzymes because there's no food to be broken down by these enzymes. So this trypsin is binding the cholecystokinin, RP, and there's no activity from the cholecystokinin. However, if you just ate food, what happens is that these proteins, trypsin, at the same time, like trypsin, yeah, you've said trypsin is responsible for activating other enzymes, but at the same time, trypsin itself is responsible for breaking down proteins. Now, when you just ate food, this trypsin will forget about the CCK-RP. Instead, it will focus on the food that you just took in, and it's going to focus on basically breaking down this food. And therefore, what does that mean? If we have a trypsin protein complex and this trypsin is no longer there, it means the CCK-RP is no longer inhibited. And that's why it's going to be activating the CCK channels here, or the I cells, and they're going to release more CCK to drive more enzymatic secretions. And we do need that because we just ate food. We need more enzymes to break down the food. So the trypsin is the main inhibitor of the activation of the pancreatic enzymes, or like the release of the pancreatic enzymes. If we get rid of this trypsin by occupying it with these proteins, the CCK-RP is going to be able to activate CCK, which will drive the enzyme secretions. Okay, let me just explain this slide first, and then I'll go to the previous slide, and then I'll check your questions. I'll check your questions. Just let me explain this slide because I need to explain to you the enzyme, the hormones, the CCK and the ACH hormone. Now, as we said, CCK is the main hormone that's responsible for driving the secretions of the enzymes to break down the food products. Now, this part right here, why is lipids in red? Because the main driver for CCK is lipids, and then a weaker activator is proteins, and carbohydrates is not really that much. What does this mean? It means that when you eat a food that is rich in lipids, or a food that is basically rich in proteins, then this is going to be a major activator for the I cells of the duodenum to secrete CCK. And if you don't want to just memorize CCK or memorize what CCK is doing, you have to understand it instead. So we just ate food and we need the enzymes to break down the food. So the food is going to stimulate I cells, or the I cells are going to react to this food, and this is going to basically stimulate CCK secretions because we have the food and we need to break down the food. So we're going to have more of the hormone that's going to be driving more enzyme secretions. Now, how does CCK drive the secretion of these enzymes? In two ways. The first one is that CCK itself, once it's released, it goes over to the pancreas and it activates the pancreas in order to release more enzymes. The second mechanism would be that the CCK activates something known as an enteropancreatic reflex. And you're gonna see the word enter something in the GI a lot, like enteropancreatic, enterogastric, enterohepatic. All this means is that we're basically activating the vagovagal reflex, or the autonomic nervous system. And the vagovagal reflex is going to release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, instead of the CCK activating the pancreas, the acetylcholine is going to activate the pancreas. And the acetylcholine will drive the pancreas to release more of the enzymes that will break down the foods. Okay? So, and it's very important to know because CCK, although it activates the pancreas itself, but this is not the major way. The main way that it does it is by activating acetylcholine, because this releases the biggest amount of the enzymes. Now, another thing that I mentioned right here is that where else do you find acetylcholine? In the parasympathetic nervous system. In the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system releases acetylcholine. And whenever you're thinking about parasympathetic nervous system, what are you also thinking of? Rest and digest. You get it? Rest and digest. So you need to digest the food. So the acetylcholine for the parasympathetic nervous system is activating the digest mechanism by releasing more enzymes to digest. So acetylcholine and CCK are responsible for the digestive mechanism. I think there's another slide right here. Yes. So this slide here shows, do you remember how we said in the previous slide that secretin is going to be activating by a secondary mechanism known as cyclic AMP through the GS adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP, protein kinase A mechanism? For the acetylcholine or the CCK, the secondary signaling pathway is that they increase the intracellular calcium levels. So they increase the intracellular calcium levels. This is the secondary mechanism. And this was the last slide we didn't explain. It's basically showing, or like it's basically a general word that says the liver of the enzymes that are going to be released in the pancreatic juice depends on your diet. So the more fatty diets you eat, then the more fatty food or the fatty enzymes that are going to be released. Okay, I'm sorry if I'm going too fast. I'm going to repeat that for you. Which part? You want me to repeat the part and I'll try to go slower. Which part do you want me to repeat? From the CCK stimulus of CCK. This part you mean? Okay, so what happens here is that the pancreas itself, if you're not eating anything, is going to release something known as a basal secretion. And it's not just for the pancreas, it's for everything. A basal tone means that the lowest tone, when there's basically no stimulus, it's going to be releasing this at the lowest level. So a basal secretion of the pancreas of trypsin will be coming out from the pancreas into the lumen of the duodenum or the small intestine. Now, the trypsin usually is responsible for what? For breaking down proteins. But this time you did not eat. You're in the period between the meals, so there's no proteins to bind on the trypsin. So the trypsin has nothing to do here. It's just roaming around freely in the duodenum. What happens is that it finds something known as CCK-RP, which is basically a stimulus protein that is driving the CCK to be released from the eye cells into the pancreas to activate the enzymes. Now, CCK-RP, if the trypsin finds it freely, is going to bind on it. And if CCK-RP is bound to trypsin, it's going to be inactivated. And if it's inactivated, it's not going to be able to release CCK. However, when you just ate food, the trypsin is no longer free. Instead, it just found the protein, and its main function is breaking down proteins. So it binds to these proteins, and therefore the CCK-RP will have nothing to bind on it to inhibit it. Instead, the CCK-RP this time can bind on these eye cell receptors to activate the release of CCK. And CCK drives the vagovagal reflex of acetylcholine or a direct stimulation of the pancreas to increase the enzyme secretions of the pancreas. Clear? And I'm sorry that I was going too fast. Do you guys have any questions in regards to the bicarbonate and the pancreatic enzyme secretions before we get to the next part? For like the bicarbonate or the pancreatic enzymes, for anything that we just explained. Now the next part will basically just be repetitions or like describing how it happens. So if you have any questions that you need me to go into the details of now, then sure. And if not, I'm gonna basically now, we're just gonna repeat everything we just said in a different way. Okay, I'll go to the next part then. So now, this slide basically describes a process known as MMC. Now, MMC is basically a process found in the body. When you're not eating, it's basically like about 90 to 120-minute process where every part of the digestive tract is going to be activated after this specific period of time. I think it was about like 120 minutes. Now, so usually the digestive tract is going to be stimulated when there is food inside of it. However, if there's no food, MMC is the main factor or the main way that is going to activate the GI tract. If there is anything stuck in your tract, it's going to be pushed over by this MMC. It basically starts from the peristalsis all the way to the end. The main hormone driver for the MMC process is going to be motilin. And what motilin does for the pancreas, in regards to the pancreas, as we said, like the MMC is going to activate everything in the GI tract. So motilin releases acetylcholine, which we said is the main stimulus for driving the pancreatic secretions. And this acetylcholine is going to increase the pancreatic secretions. And when does this occur in the MMC process? In the phase 3 of MMC. All clear? I think that was the last slide, and then now it's going to be like more of putting everything together. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask now. Okay, let's start. So now the regulations of the pancreatic secretions. It's divided into 3 phases: the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. A cephalic phase is basically everything that's happening. The cephalic basically refers to the region above the neck, or like the head region, or the neck and head region. The gastric phase is the stomach, and the intestine is the intestines. Now, for the cephalic phase, as you just start smelling, tasting, or chewing the food, this is going to activate the vagus nerve. Well, it's separate, right? It's activating the vagus nerve of the, like from the mouth. It's not activating it from the CCK or anything. It's just activating it from the mouth activity. And this is going to basically drive the acetylcholine. And this is acetylcholine is going to start the secretions in the pancreas. So the first part of the secretion of the pancreas is going to start from the mouth, from the acetylcholine released by the vagus nerve, to the ducts. To the acetylcholine is released by the vagus nerve during the cephalic phase, and it just contributes to a small amount. It's not really that much. The next phase is going to be the gastric phase, and also the same mechanism. Activation of the vagus nerve from the stomach activity is going to lead to a release of acetylcholine, and it's going to drive the release of more enzymes. Now, these 2 parts are not, you see, it's just contributing 25% and 5 to 10%. It's not giving that much. And it's the main mechanism is that the activity happening in the mouth or the stomach is activating the vagus nerve, which is going to be releasing acetylcholine. Now, main part though is the intestinal phase. Intestinal phase is divided into 2 phases, or like 2 parts. The one that's going to be activated by the acids, and the ones activated by the acid is going to drive the secretion of the bicarbonate. And this is the first one right here. So the acid is going to drive the secretion of bicarbonate from the duct cells. And this is driven by secretin. There's no more vagus nerve this time, since it's in the intestine. Is going to be driven by the intestinal hormones, which is secretin. This is the first part. And then the second part, the intestinal phase, is going to be responsible for releasing the enzymes. And what is the function of the enzymes? Enzymes are to break down the food. So it's going to be stimulated by the presence of food. But what type of food? Specifically, lipids and slightly proteins. So the lipids is the main driver for the cholecystokinin, and the protein is the less, but like also works on the cholecystokinin. And this is going to be releasing the cholecystokinin, which drives the release of the pancreatic enzymes. And how it does that again? 2 mechanisms: direct activation, or activating the vagus nerve, which leads to the activation of the enteropancreatic system. Now, cholecystokinin from the vagal afferent act on the vagal afferent to release acetylcholine and the VIP on the ducts, and then the CCK from the eye cells enter the circulation to directly activate. This is the first mechanism, direct activation, and the second one is the enteropancreatic reflex, and both of them are working to drive more release of enzymes. This is basically what this slide says, is that the serotonin, which is basically 5-HT released from the enterochromaffin cells, is also going to drive the release of pancreatic enzymes. However, you don't really want to focus much on the 5-HT, as it's not really the main hormone. Like it's just like one of the functions of the hormone. However, the main hormone that's responsible for this activity is cholecystokinin by activating acetylcholine. Okay? So if you got asked any questions in regards to the pancreatic enzymes, it's cholecystokinin through acetylcholine. And if you got asked any question in regards to the acids, it's going to be secretin, which is going to be releasing or secreting the bicarbonate. So secretin to secrete the bicarbonate that's going to neutralize the acid from the stomach. Now, 2 more pathological cases. Before we get to them, is everything clear so far? Because this is the end of the slide. So is everything clear previously? Okay. Now the pathology, there's 2 main pathologies that you need to know. First one is a pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is basically anything that ends with itis is inflammation. So pancreatitis is inflammation of the pancreas. There are multiple causes that could lead to pancreatitis. But like the main idea behind it is that we're gonna have the enzymes of the pancreas being activated in the pancreas, and this is going to lead to destruction of the pancreas. It could be due to chemical injury, such as alcohol, or washout failure due to cystic fibrosis. Because cystic fibrosis is basically a deficiency in the CFTR receptor, and the CFTR was responsible for taking the chloride outside. So if we can't regulate the chloride and the bicarbonate, then we're not going to have these, we're not going to have the release of bicarbonate. So we're going to have acidity in the pancreas, which is going to lead to pancreatitis. It could be gallstones or obstruction in the pathways or the ducts, or it could be a surgery, like any type of surgery that could lead to an inflammation in the pancreas. The main symptoms of pancreatitis will include steatorrhea, which is basically there's going to be fats inside the, like a diarrhea with fats, because the pancreatitis is the pancreas has the bile duct passing through. So if we damage the pancreas, then we're going to have some obstructions on the bile duct. And if the bile is not secreted to the intestines, then we're not going to be able to absorb these fats. So the fats are not going to be absorbed, and they're going to go all the way out and go into something referred to as steatorrhea. Diarrhea, which is basically like there's no absorption of stuff, so they're going to be excreted. Malabsorption, because the pancreatic enzymes or the pancreas is not functioning to release enzymes, so we can't break down the foods and we cannot absorb the food. And abdominal discomfort or just pain, because you have an inflamed pancreas, so you're going to feel some pain. Okay, so this is the first part regarding pancreatitis. Next thing is an exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. The same pancreatic insufficiency. Exocrine is basically the pancreas has two functions, endocrine and exocrine. Endocrine is for releasing insulin and glucagon, basically releasing hormones, but don't worry about that now. Focus on the exocrine. Exocrine is excreting the enzymes. So the exocrine pancreas, or the pancreas responsible for secreting the enzymes, is insufficient or is not working. So what you're going to have, basically the patient is going to have something known as or the patient is going to have some diarrheas or like malabsorption of food because he's not able to release the enzymes to break down the food. Instead, what you give him is enzyme replacement therapy. He can't make the enzymes, so you just give him enzymes. Okay? And this is a last summary slide. Let's go over the summary slide real quick, and hopefully you're going to understand everything after that, and then we're going to have some questions. So, the pancreas mainly is responsible for secreting an isotonic fluid. Isotonicity is determined by the sodium. The acinar cells are releasing sodiums that won't be changed, therefore the pancreas fluid is going to remain isotonic. Now, the main function is releasing bicarbonate and enzymes. Enzymes to break down the food and absorb the food, and the bicarbonate, which is going to be responsible for neutralizing the acid and activating the enzymes. The bicarbonate is going to be released by the duct cells. The main stimulus hormone is secretin, which is going to be in response to acidity, because we have too much acid, so we're trying to release secretin, to release the bicarbonate, to get rid of the acid. Now, secretin is going to activate a cyclic AMP pathway, which activates a CFTR channel. The CFTR is going to release the chloride, which is going to be the driving force for a HCO3- Cl- or anion exchanger. This is going to release the bicarbonate to the outside. If there was a low flow rate, means there's not enough stimulation, means we don't need a lot of the bicarbonate. If there's a low flow rate, there's not enough stimulation, means we don't need so much bicarbonate. Therefore, it's going to have a lot of chloride and too little bicarbonate. Most of the bicarbonate will be reabsorbed. However, if there was a high flow rate, means that we're having too much stimulation, means we're like telling the pancreas to work. We have so much acid, we need to get rid of the acid. So we're going to have increased bicarbonate and decreased chloride. For the enzymes are released as zymogens or inactive proteins, because if they were active, they are going to lead to inflammation known as pancreatitis. The enzymes are released by the acinar cells, or the main cells at the start. The main stimulus is going to be a hormone known as CCK. CCK is released by the eye cells that are found in the duodenum. CCK is released in response to primarily fats. However, it could be released to proteins, but less actively. And then sugars or carbohydrates is not as much. So mainly fats, most importantly, and then less actively proteins. What CCK does is either directly activates or activates the enteropancreatic system of the vagus nerve through acetylcholine, and this drives the release of enzymes. Now, the main activator of the peptide enzymes, or the enzyme responsible for breaking down proteins, is the trypsin. So trypsin is released as trypsinogen to prevent the breaking down of the pancreas. Trypsinogen in the lumen of the duodenum is going to be activated by an enzyme, and if that's found, or is basically an enzyme on the brush border of the duodenum cells, known as enteropeptidase. Enteropeptidase activates the trypsin, and once trypsin is activated, it activates all the other enzymes. Activates the more trypsin, activates every other enzyme that's responsible for breaking down the proteins. And last 2 points are a trypsin inhibitor, which is going to be released in order to prevent the trypsin from being activated inside the cell and this, or inside the pancreas, and the CCK-RP, or the protein that's going to be activating the CCK. Again, if there is trypsin and there is no food for the trypsin to bind on, it's going to bind on the CCK-RP, and there's going to be no releasing. There's no release, so RP releasing peptide. There's no release of CCK. However, if there is food and the trypsin is active in breaking down the food or the proteins, the CCK-RP is going to be free, and it's going to act on the CCK or the I channels in order to release more CCK. And the two diseases are pancreatitis, which is inflammation of the pancreas, driven primarily by any problems in the enzymes being activated inside the pancreas, or pancreatic enzyme insufficiency, in which the pancreas is not releasing enough enzymes, and therefore we need to give the patient enzymes from outside to help him digest and absorb the food. Is it all clear? Do you have any questions? And then we can go to the practice questions if you're clear. I'm gonna go over the slides again. If you have anything, just let me know. All right, all clear? Okay, then I'm not gonna go back then. Okay, so let's start solving the questions. So this is the first question. If any of you wants to unmute and like try to answer with us, then it's cool. You can do that. If not, you can just type the answer in the chat. I'm gonna read the question for you, and then I want to see your answers. Which of the following hormones is produced in the duodenum in response to digestion products and stimulates the pancreas in a true hormonal fashion to produce an enzyme-rich secretion? What do you think the answer is? A, CCK. Yes, correct. The answer is CCK, because CCK is the main enzyme or hormone for the enzyme-rich secretion. Okay, the next question. How does secretin stimulate secretion of bicarbonate from the pancreas? How does secretin stimulate the secretion of bicarbonate from the pancreas? An ECFTR. Okay, you want to also try to answer 1E and 1D. Okay, so does any of you want to try and explain, like, why did you say E or why did you say D? Or just gonna explain it, because if you don't understand it, just let me know. Okay, so the correct answer in this one is E, CFTR, or the chloride channels. What secretin is done or is doing, basically secretin is released to secrete. To secrete what? To secrete the bicarbonate. And this bicarbonate is really, like it says, secretin, secrete. To secrete the bicarbonate, neutralize the acid. So we have so much acid, right? Now, I have this picture again, I'm sorry. Now, secretin activates the cyclic AMP, which is going to open up the CFTR channel. And the CFTR channel releases the chloride, which drives the bicarbonate channel. Now, you said D, which is the acetylcholine levels. Acetylcholine is not for the secretin. It's for the other hormone, which is CCK, which is basically acetylcholine is a driver for the parasympathetic nervous system. A parasympathetic nervous system is basically responsible for resting and digesting. If you need to digest, you need the enzymes. And so acetylcholine is responsible for releasing the enzymes. And this is going to be driven with CCK, acetylcholine and CCK to digest with the enzymes. And so the correct answer is E in this one. I hope it's clear. Next question. A 2-month-old baby boy presents with vomiting and diarrhea and failure to thrive. On investigation, edema and ascites are found. Blood values show hypoproteinemia. Several attempts with different protein diets are unsuccessful, but the administration of pancreatic enzymes alleviates the symptoms. A genetic profile reveals a rare disease of a rare deficiency of an intestinal brush border enzyme. Which of the following enzymes is most likely defective? C. Okay. Now, do you want to try to answer also? Okay, yes, you're right. Both of you are right. It's C, enteropeptidase, which is basically like, it's responsible for breaking down the trypsin. And how did we get this part? Because he said that, or all you need to know is that he talked about intestinal brush border enzyme. But if you really want to analyze it, the question, what he's saying is that the patient has some pancreatic insufficiency or pancreatic enzyme deficiency. So they're giving him pancreatic enzymes. So the problem is something from the patient himself. That's going to be the intestinal brush border. All you need to know is this word. Okay, this is last question. As a part of a large grant studying pancreatic adenocarcinoma, baseline data of the pancreatic exocrine secretions are obtained from healthy people. Which of the following findings is expected? A, its enzyme concentration is increased with pancreatic polypeptide. Its bicarbonate concentration increases with increasing chloride. Its bicarbonate concentration increases with secretin stimulation. Its sodium and potassium concentrations increases with increasing flow rate. Its osmolality is less than 100 at an average flow rate. What do you guys think? C, you're right. Its bicarbonate concentration increases with secretin stimulation. All right, that was it, guys. Do you have any questions before we close? Is it all good? I'm glad. Hope you guys have a good day. Thank you so much.